Hi everyone, today we take a close look at the life of Chet Atkins. Chet Atkins is considered to be the godfather of fingerstyle guitar, the country gentleman Mr. Guitar himself. As always, I don't pretend to know everything. All of the info in this video was taken from interviews with Chet, as well as stories from people who have worked with him. If you have any additional stories or corrections, please drop them down below in the comments. Also, let me know what song you would like to see a tutorial on. I won't be playing any of Chet's music in this video due to copyright issues, but I'll happily make a few lessons based on your input. Chet Atkins was born on June 20th, 1924 in Luttrell, Tennessee. He was the youngest child of a large family since his mother and father both had children from a previous marriage. His father was a music teacher and piano tuner, his mother played the banjo, and all of his siblings could play an instrument. Chet was surrounded by music from birth, but it was far from a smooth start in life. Chet's relation with his father was very difficult, and Chet learned later in life that his father had a suspicion that Chet wasn't really his son. Chet did turn out looking more like his father than anyone else of the children, but the lack of affection certainly made its mark during those early years. So it's no surprise his parents separated when Chet was 6 years old, after which he was raised by his mother. She later remarried and the family lived on a tobacco farm and had a very hard time making ends meet. Chet later stated in an interview they were so poor that they never even noticed the huge economic crash of 1929 and the following recession. When you're already down at rock bottom, you can't drop any lower. Chet started out on the ukulele first, but even buying strings was out of the question. Chet resolved this by pulling a wire out of the screen door and fitting this on his ukulele. It would only stay in tune for so long, but it was the only option he had. Later on, he switched over to the fiddle, and it was at age 9 when he finally got his hands on his first guitar. His brother Lowell traded him an old beat-up guitar for some chores around the house and a gun. A 9-year-old Chet Atkins traded his gun for a guitar. The guitar was a Sears and Roebuck guitar, and it had seen some rough times. It had a nail as a nut and the neck had been broken at the 12th fret, giving the guitar a half-inch action. Whenever they had guests that played the guitar around the house, little Chet would stand so close to them that it would become impossible for them to play, literally trying to put his ear on the guitar. But after a while, the relationship with his stepfather turned sour too, and he ended up being chased from the property, leaving him without a family home, forcing him to relocate and live with his father. The difficult relationship with both father figures could be an explanation for Chet's seemingly shy and self-deprecating personality. But for Chet it was worse than was apparent from his behavior. In letters to a friend, he later referred to the years on the farm in Tennessee as the worst years of his life. And Chet himself would describe the impact on his life as being the foundation for a lifelong massive inferiority complex. The most positive thing about this period in his life was his relationship with his half-brother Jim, who Chet absolutely idolized. Jim Atkins was 13 years older and he played the guitar for a living, playing on shows on network radio before joining Les Paul's backing band. And it was through Jim that Chet acquired a more playable guitar that allowed him to progress further. Chet Atkins learned to play guitar on a guitar sold to him by the legend Les Paul. In his youth, Chet was diagnosed with a critical asthma condition. Because of this illness, Chet was forced to sleep in a straight back chair. That way he could breathe comfortably. Chet would take up the habit of playing his guitar in that upright chair until he fell asleep holding it, and this habit would last for the rest of his life. At this point, he had no specific style yet, but that all changed in 1939 when he heard Merle Travis on the radio. The story is much like Tommy Emmanuel hearing Chet for the first time. Hearing Merle play even through an old crackling radio with bad reception, Chet realized Merle was playing the bass and the melody at the same time. With this new drive, Chet would develop into an accomplished guitar player during his high school years, mostly using the school restroom to practice because he liked the reverb in there. He was also heavily into technology, at one point getting his hands on the components needed to build an amplifier. Chet put together the amp, got himself a contact pickup for his guitar, and then realized they did not have electricity at the house. So he had to walk miles and miles with his guitar and his amp in hand looking for an outlet. Probably a completely different quest in the early 40s compared to now. After dropping out of high school in 1942, Chet started working as a live musician on radio shows, starting out on fiddle and switching to guitar later on. First in Knoxville, where he backed singer Bill Carlisle and comic Archie Campbell, and he would later move to Ohio to the radio station where Merle Travis had previously worked. And in this line of work you played a lot. A normal day would consist of playing the morning live show on the radio, followed by the afternoon live program. The artists would be different, but the musicians did both shows. And then at night, Chet would often play live, mostly in the broadcasting radius of the radio he worked for. That meant he would have to drive up to 150 miles to get to the gig and the same distance back home. 150 miles for Europeans, that's roughly 250 kilometers. And in the morning, Chet was present for the radio live show again. In this time, Chet's shy personality worked against him, and his sophisticated style often inspired the remark that he wasn't truly country. He would also get fired from those radio shows, one time even because people thought they were listening to two average guitar players rather than one amazing guitar player doing everything on one guitar. For a long time, a lot of people thought Chet was using a recording trick to get his sound, and he didn't get the proper credit he deserved. Luckily, the musicians Chet worked with started catching on, and after working with a few other bands, he got signed to RCA Victor in 46 or 47. That one is a bit sketchy. Merle Travis had become a hit recording artist by that time, and record labels were looking for something similar. In the story as told by Merle Travis, a record scout with a then unknown Chet Atkins and said they were looking for an artist that could compete with the success that Merle was having at the time. Chet said he could do it, no problem. When the scout asked if Chet could sing, he replied, "Nope, can't sing a note." To which the scout replied, "Well, that is a shame. We were hoping you could sing like Merle." And Chet, without missing a beat, replies, "Oh, well, yeah, I can sing like that." Even before having a hit, Chet's stature as an unparalleled musician grew quickly, and he started assisting session leader and producer Stephen Scholes, who was based in New York. He would also score his first hit for RCA with Mr. Sandman. Chet's career was about to take off like a rocket. Stephen Scholes got promoted in '57, and he quickly put Chet in charge of RCA Victor's Nashville division. At that time, country music sales were down as rock and roll was on the rise. In order to keep country music and the jobs it offered viable in that period, some changes were made to the music. Fiddles and lap steel and pedal steel guitars were scrapped, making country music more appealing to pop fans. The media labeled this new sound within country as the Nashville sound, and Chet was instrumental in the formation of this new style. and Chet knew exactly what he was aiming for. When asked what the Nashville sound was, Chet would reach into one of his pockets and jingle some loose coins in there, implying he knew exactly what it was about: selling records and making money. And although Chet would quickly become one of the biggest producers around, his personality remained the same, and he would always treat his musicians with respect. Chet would, for instance, never single out someone during a session when there was, for instance, a tuning problem. He would simply refer to everyone to check their tuning and get the problem sorted out without anyone having to take the blame for a ruined take. With this in mind, it's no wonder Chet worked with almost everyone during this period. Listing all of the artists is simply impossible, but names like Elvis Presley, Hank Williams, the Everly Brothers, Willie Nelson, Dolly Parton and Jerry Reed should ring a bell for most people. In less than 10 years' time, Chet was promoted as well, and he became vice president of the RCA's country division, a promotion he would later admit in an interview he was ashamed of. After all, he wanted nothing else than to be known as a guitar player. In the 70s, Chet's executive duties started to weigh on him, and he got increasingly more stressed. He produced fewer records, but he did record extensively with fellow fingerpicker Jerry Reed, who he had convinced to switch over to RCA Records. All of that changed when Chet was diagnosed with colon cancer in 1973. After that, Chet would redefine his role at RCA, delegate his administration and producing jobs to other people, and get back to his first love, the guitar. He recorded with, among others, Jerry Reed and Les Paul. The album Chester and Lester with Les Paul was one of his biggest selling albums of his career, but also laid bare some frustrations with RCA. They wouldn't let him venture into jazz territory. They wanted to stick him to country music. This would eventually lead to a breakup, and Chet would switch to Columbia Records after working for RCA for 35 years. After having to defend the jazz influence in his playing for almost his entire adult life, Chet could now make any album he wanted. He also often fought the term country guitarist when he was introduced, stating that he was a guitarist, period. In the later years, Chet would partner with other greats like Mark Knopfler, even more with Jerry Reed and with Tommy Emmanuel, who was, at that time, a new and relatively unknown face for many. But in terms of health, Chet was not in a good place. He had battled cancer for almost 25 years at this point, starting with that first diagnosis of colon cancer in '73. By the 90s, he had been diagnosed with cancer no less than 5 times in total. He tried to keep this quiet, as well as the fact that he had suffered from a stroke and had a benign brain tumor removed. But the operation and the treatment of the brain tumor had some side effects that made it hard to hide. For a while, Chet had a hard time speaking to other people, struggling to find the right words. His hand coordination was impacted as well, but with lots of practice, he overcame this problem. Chet continued to perform well into the 1990s, but was diagnosed with colon cancer once more in '96. On June 30th, 2001, the country gentleman passed away at his home in Nashville, Tennessee, at the age of 77. His memorial was held at the legendary Ryman Auditorium in Nashville. Now, how can you possibly summarize the legacy of one of the most influential musicians of the 20th century? We can start out by pointing that Chet, among others, is widely credited for the invention of the sound that saved country music. We're not talking about a song or an album or a legendary live performance. According to a lot of people, he saved a whole music style of going out of business. And While we know quite a few artists that helped a certain style break through, doing the opposite is probably even harder, especially if you take into account this happened in a golden age for new music. Chet helped country music bridge the impact of musical giants like Elvis Presley, the Beatles, and Jimi Hendrix, to name but a few. That alone would be enough to be considered a legend. But for us fingerstyle guitar players, he was more, much more. Chet Atkins is seen as the godfather of fingerstyle guitar, creating the style almost out of thin air. He developed the fingerstyle technique most of us use today almost by accident. He heard Merle Travis on the radio and wanted to play just like him. Merle only used his thumb and index finger, but Chet didn't know that. No TV, no internet, no YouTube to check, so Chet used his thumb and 3 fingers instead, only leaving out the pinky on the picking hand. By doing so, he developed what we now know as the standard fingerstyle picking hand technique. But Chet was always down to earth about it, stating in an interview in '96 that it all happened out of ignorance and not knowing what was really happening. He simply found his own way of playing what he wanted. He also credited his living conditions for developing this technique. Again, in his own words, we lived way out in the stick, meaning very far away from civilization, and that is the reason why I play like I do. I didn't have anyone else to play with. Chet would never stop idolizing Merle Travis, once telling him in person, "My biggest claim to fame is that I can tell everyone you are my friend." And Chet was a hard-working picker too. Without counting his producing record and sticking to his solo records only, he released 58 studio albums, 30 collaboration albums and 4 live albums. That is over 90 albums as a solo artist alone, racking up countless others as a producer. Chet would often record the backing tracks for his albums in the studio, taking the tapes home and recording his own tracks in the peace and quiet of his home basement studio. Yes, Chet had a home studio back in the 50s and 60s. He was a real freak about electronics and built many parts of the studio himself. And he was experimenting all the time, not only with electronics and recording techniques, but also adding bits and pieces to his guitars to see what it would sound like. To him, a guitar was never really yours if you hadn't taken a screwdriver to it or added some bits of tape left and right. And he was never satisfied, and he always thought he could play it better. And his approach paid off. Chet won 14 Grammy Awards, 9 Country Music Association Awards, 4 Instrumentalist of the Year. He also won a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. The Billboard Century Award, was inducted in the Country Music Hall of Fame in '73 and added to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2002 after he had passed away. Saving a style of music, inventing a whole new way of playing the guitar. Anything else? Well, what about co-designing one of the most iconic guitars out there? The Gretsch 6120 model was the result of Chet teaming up with Gretsch. At the time, Gretsch probably knew it wasn't going to be easy. Chet had to be convinced to put down his trusty handmade D'Angelico guitar for an almost experimental guitar. And Chet really didn't like the prototypes they showed him. So he had some input in designing the Gretsch 6120, but was much more involved with one of the next models, the 6122 Country Gentleman. Chet also had a hand in creating and popularizing the Gretsch Filtertron pickup together with the original inventor Ray Butts. The relationship with Gretsch, however, would be one with many bumps in the road. Chet would pressure Gretsch into making guitars that had a solid piece of wood going from the neck all the way to the tailpiece to increase feedback resistance. But Gretsch always refused, claiming plank guitars are a joke. He would also offer them the idea of a solid body nylon string, again to battle on-stage feedback, something that was rejected as well. That solid body nylon string would become the first project Chet completed once he switched over to Gibson in the 80s after Gretsch went out of business. In doing so, he gave us another unique instrument, albeit one that is attractive only for a much more specialized group of musicians. Anything else to add to this already mind-blowing legacy? Well, let's finish the video by focusing on the kind of person Chet Atkins was. According to a 2001 interview with Janis Ian, a singer-songwriter who worked with Chet extensively, Chet was an exceptional person who always made a point of doing what was right, no matter what everyone else thought. When Chet emerged from the rural Tennessee countryside and headed to the city of Knoxville, he was ridiculed by everyone he came across for all sorts of things. His thick accent, his clothing, his way of eating. Even decades later, Chet's lips would compress in anger thinking about those incidents. To him, it was unforgivable that they judged him by his appearance rather than his worth as a musician. Maybe that is why Chet always made sure to do what was right. He did so when he started to work with Charlie Pride, an Afro-American singer who was determined to make his mark in the white bastion of country music. Take in mind that this was in a time where racial tensions were high and the civil rights movement was in full swing. Chet didn't care. He went out of his way to make sure they were photographed together for the newspapers and also took Charlie out for breakfast, ignoring all the stares he would get in the breakfast room. And Janis Ian, still in the same interview, talks about how she would soon find herself out, how fiercely Chet would protect those he called his own. When she came out as being gay, the press made a huge deal about it, even being featured on the news on CNN. Janis was expecting problems too from the conservative Nashville industry, but nothing really happened there. Later on, she learned that Chet, without her knowing, as soon as he saw the response in the media, called up all of his friends who he thought might have a problem with it and gave them one simple message: any problem you have with her, you have with me. And then, when the female couple bought a house and gave a housewarming party, Chet, who never went anywhere, turned up and spent a few hours at the party, serving notice to the community that the new couple was all right with him. So, Chet was a remarkable man. And although he was a leading figure in 20th century music, he would stay humble and down to earth. In an interview in the 90s, he stated, "I've been an amateur all my life." There are a lot of great quotes by Chet, like this one: "Approach your guitar intelligently, and if there are limits, don't deny them. Work within your restrictions. Some things you can do better than others, some things you can't do as well. So accentuate the positive." Another favorite on learning how to play is this one: "It takes a lot of devotion and work, or should I say play, because if you love it, that's what it amounts to. I haven't found any shortcuts and I've been looking for a long time." The most touching remarks I could find about Chet was in the final part of the interview with Janis Ian I talked about earlier. I'm going to read it out in full, not changing a word. "It was Chet who taught me to make my playing look effortless. He understood that for the guitarist, the flashiest licks are usually the easiest. Once you've gotten them into your muscle memory, they are yours for life. It's the slow ones that stay difficult, competing with the hand's desire for motion and the heart's insistence on speed. It was Chet who taught me that you don't have to wave flags or shout expletives to make things change. You just have to live your life as though everyone else's bigotry doesn't exist and make a point of doing the right thing in public. It was Chet who taught me that the occasional bad joke keeps morale up better than an expensive gift. that it's nice to get awards, but more fun to sit in the basement and tinker with a new toy. That it's great to be acknowledged as one of the greatest guitar players in the world, but it's better to learn a brand new lick. That if you behave humbly, sooner or later you will find yourself truly humble, and that humility is something we all need to learn. I have nothing more to add. What a legend. Let's just let all of that sink in. I will see you next time. Take care. Bye bye.